Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Midweek COVID update of 9th of February. So today I'm going to start off a little bit differently. We'll start off with a global view. Let me just get my share screen. So get on to presentation mode. Whoops. All right. So this is a picture. It was taken 2 days ago on the steps of the Capitol. It's a picture of the congressional leaders holding a special commemoration of 900,000 people that have succumbed to the COVID pandemic since it started. So we're looking at a global view to date. In fact, let me get my pointer up. Some 5.7 million people, probably much higher. This is not unknown, but the true figure is probably quite a bit higher than this, are known to have died of COVID since it started. So it's an average of 250,000 people every month. Where are we at in South Africa? So far known to have died of COVID, just under 100,000, 96,289. The Medical Research Council feels this is probably about 2 or 3 times the true figure. That's going on excess deaths, which coincide with the COVID waves. So just looking back over the past 2 years, we can see the toll that COVID has taken globally on humanity. Just sticking with global, fortunately now it looks in many countries that the Omicron-driven wave is starting to come down in many countries, Israel, Denmark, United States, and of course in South Africa as well. Nevertheless, going back to the United States, because Omicron has infected so many more people, although it is a much milder illness than its predecessor variants, because it has affected so many more people, the overall severe disease and deaths, in fact, is pretty comparable. In fact, it's about 70 to 80% the peak of this latest Omicron-driven wave as compared to the first wave, the pre-vaccine wave. So it still has exacted quite a severe toll, despite being a much milder illness per person. And this is our, coming back now locally, this is the latest dashboard from the NICD. We're varying between 1,000 and 3,000 to 4,000 cases per day, still 20 deaths per day. So still grumbling on at a fairly low level, but again has not disappeared. Coming back to the 7-day moving epidemic curve, coming down, but has not gone all the way down. So we're still getting this kink over here. This is a little bit out of date, unfortunately, but this is what they're talking about when they say there's a plateau. And we can see this also when you look at the R number, the reproductive number, which governs how many people get infected from an infected person, and is a measure of the status of the epidemic. Below 1, as I've mentioned in previous occasions, means that we're sort of in an endemic phase. Above 1, we're in the epidemic phase. But you can see it's starting to creep up a little bit over here. And also Hatzola data and the Jewish community also starting to creep up a little bit from down 3 weeks ago of 32 to 53 2 weeks ago, and a week ago, the last week, up to 73. And again, also a slight increase in the active cases under the Hatzola home monitoring program. And in some of the provinces, particularly Gauteng, in fact, there's been a 20% increase. And that's the week before last. Free State also 20%, Mpumalanga 23%. Other provinces we've seen decreases, but overall nationally a 4% increase. So that's that slight plateau that I mentioned before. Hospital admissions nationally coming down, just ignore the last one, that's just incomplete reporting, gradually coming down over January and February. In Gauteng, there was a period at the end of January where it kind of stabilized. In other words, the number of hospital admissions did not decrease, but now is starting to decrease somewhat. So coming back to our epidemic curve, you can see that there is now a sort of a kind of a temporary halt in the decline of this sharp Omicron different fourth wave. And what is that due to? That's due to the subvariants. I think I mentioned it last week as well, of Omicron. Remember, Omicron is a variant independent of the previous variants, the alpha, gamma, beta, and delta variants. But Omicron itself, coming again from a very variable, mutable virus, has mutations and has now developed subvariants. And so far, there are these 4 subvariants. The main one, which we had up to now, was BA.1. The main second subvariant is BA.2, and there is 1.1 and a minor one, BA.3. All an expression of the ability of all these SARS-CoV-2 viruses, but now Omicron particularly, to undergo mutations. And unfortunately, the BA.2 has tended to be a little bit more infectious, a little bit more contagious than BA.1, and appears to be a fitter subvariant of Omicron. Just to illustrate, it's a bit of a technical diagram, I apologize for that, but just to show at the various sites where there have been mutations, mutations mean a change in the building block at that particular site of the genome, or substitutions or deletions where that building block has been omitted. So there's the BA.1 sequence, BA.1.1, BA.2, and BA.3. Each of them having subtle changes, differences in the actual building block structure of the genome. And going a bit technical, but just to show that these can actually be mapped onto the spike protein itself. So this is the receptor site, the human receptor site, on which the virus latches onto. The RBD is the receptor binding domain, that motif, that kind of part of the spike protein which actually latches on to the receptor site. NTD, the N-terminal domain, don't worry about the terminology, also assists the virus getting into the cell. And the cleavage site, which cleaves, it divides the spike protein from the S2 to the S1, and that allows the virus to get into the cell. So the bottom line is that all of these mutations have now increased the infectivity of the BA.2 subvariant over BA.1. And as a result, these are the various curves. BA.2 is now starting to increase. BA.1 was the main Omicron variant in South Africa. It was more fit than Delta. Delta is more fit than Beta. Beta is more fit than the ancestral variant. But now BA.2, being more contagious, is even more fit than the BA.1 Omicron and is starting to displace it. And this just shows, this is one measure of the infectivity, the secondary attack rate, the number of people that get infected secondarily from an index case in a household contact. For BA.2, 13.4% higher than 10.3% for the BA.1, the original Omicron variant. And you can see here that the BA.2, the brown columns over here, is starting to increase over the BA.1 in South Africa. This is a little bit outdated. Probably now BA.2 is at least as much, at least 50% of the Omicron subvariants compared to BA.1, and probably will overtake it due to its increased fitness, due to its increased contagiousness, infectivity. In some countries, in fact, in India and Denmark, BA.2 has now become very much the dominant subvariant. But fortunately, I should mention before I go into what I was going to say just now, BA.2 doesn't appear to be more vaccine evasive. In other words, the vaccine or immunity seems to be at least as good for BA.2 as BA.1. But nevertheless, being more infectious, it is more fit. What I do want to get on now is quite an important couple of points I want to bring up. I did show you this last week, the changes to the regulations affecting mainly the isolation and mainly the quarantine, and to some extent not really affecting our schools so much, but certainly other schools, the abolishment of rotational and going on to full school attendance. But the important thing I really want to point out that there aren't changes to the other regulations. The mask regulations still remain. The advice about social gatherings still remain, and so on. And I really do need to re-emphasize it, because one of the kind of worries which many of us in the field were concerned about was that the relaxation of the isolation and quarantine regulations, we were worried that it might create a kind of a false feeling that the epidemic is now over, and this can generalize to other infection prevention measures being discarded. I think it's really important to re-emphasize that these are not recommended to be discarded at this stage, despite relaxing isolation and quarantine. And South Africa, we really kind of would follow international best practices, the Center for Disease Control, with regard to schools, that the CD recommends indoor masking for all students. In fact, from 2 years and older, we've been a little bit more lenient. We felt that preschool children can dispense with the masking. But certainly in the indoor environment, masking still remains mandatory in the classroom situation. And I should also mention in situations like in schools, because what I've been hearing from a number of congregations that they've now dispensed with masks in the school environment. And the school environment is particularly a risky environment, because you've got people in the indoor environment for a relatively prolonged period of time, often with singing or with loud voices when they're giving a shiur and so on. And that is particularly hazardous situation. Now, I agree that the epidemic has come down, the risk is considerably lower, but it has not disappeared. And I think it is essential at this stage to maintain certainly mask wearing and keeping social distancing. Hopefully this will go away, and hopefully sooner rather than later. But as it stands at the moment, where the epidemic is now, we do still need to retain masking. And again, just to show, this is a very recent publication, came out, in fact, a week ago, and demonstrating a study over a year in California, the value of masks. A cloth mask, chances of testing positive reduced by 56, with the odds of getting the other way around, odds of becoming positive, 56% lower odds with the cloth mask, 66% with a surgical mask, 83% with a N95, which is probably not practical in this situation. At least 66% lowering of infection by wearing a mask. And the other aspect that we were worried about is that it might increase vaccine hesitancy. And unfortunately, we are still pretty low. 65,000 doses over the last 24 hours, vastly lower than what we are aiming for, with a target of 300,000. And we still got this considerably large gap that a third of individuals, 60 plus, have not been vaccinated at all. And fully vaccinated, it's now 39% of the individuals over 60 plus have not been fully vaccinated. So we still are very vulnerable to what may come. And again, just to kind of emphasize the value of vaccination, these are deaths from the United States per 100,000. Unvaccinated, 7.8. Vaccinated, 13 times lower, 0.6. And with a booster vaccination, in fact, 78 times lower. So undoubtedly, vaccination has a major, major role in preventing deaths, in preventing severe disease, and preventing hospitalization. And the same in many other states as well. I won't go through in the interest of time. So this is where we are at the moment. We are now vulnerable to subvariants to some extent. Fortunately, the subvariants are not more virulent than the original B1 subvariant of Omicron. What may come in the future, we don't know. There may well be another variant of SARS-CoV-2, or there may be even another coronavirus, not SARS-CoV-2, but another SARS-CoV virus. Maybe I can deal with it next week and just kind of give you sort of a kind of bird's eye view of what the potential dangers are in the future. So I'll stop there and now just deal with some of the questions which have come in. Let me start off. I get a number of questions which come from people asking me about travel advice, what the regulations are, mainly to Israel, also to the United States, United Kingdom, Europe, and so on. And I must be honest, this is something that I can't really kind of give you up-to-date information for two reasons. They keep on changing, and also they're different from country to country. And the people who are in the best place to kind of answer these questions are really the travel agents. Well, in the case of Israel, the Israel Center, they do have the up-to-date information about what the regulations are in terms of vaccine requirements, in terms of testing before travel. So I plead with you rather to kind of contact those agencies who've got more reliable, more up-to-date information than what I have. I got another question about the vaccination of young children under the age of 12. Just to reiterate again, this has not been registered. Vaccines have not been registered for children under the age of 12 by the regulatory authority. So clearly it can't be part of the strategy as yet. I think it's still going to be some time before vaccination is extended to children under the age of 12. Then another question came in about why are the figures so high in Gauteng compared to other provinces? I think just to mention, Omicron started, the start of the epidemic was in Gauteng. There were a couple of super spreading events which triggered it off. So it started in Gauteng, then spread to the rest of the country. Also, of course, Gauteng has the most densest human population, and also one of the lowest vaccine coverage. It's about just over 30-something%, as against, for example, the Western Cape, which is just under 50%. And part of the reason for this is that, particularly in the informal settlements, there's a lot of distrust, unfortunately, for vaccination. The reach is not so great. And this all contributes, I think, to the greater amount of virus circulating in the Gauteng province. And then lastly, a question about screens. Now, of course, screens do reduce the risk of transmission. These perspex screens or glass screens in front of, for example, cashiers, banks, etc., etc. What was brought up in this question is due to the fact that that the virus is transmitted through aerosols change the picture. Not really. Just to reiterate what I mentioned last week, in the early days, the understanding of how COVID was spread, how the SARS-CoV-2 was spread, was thought to be spread almost entirely by droplets. Droplets are the larger fluid particles coming out from the upper respiratory tract. And because they are larger particles, they don't remain suspended in the air and they fall rapidly onto surfaces. And this is where the question about surfaces being a source of contamination. We know now that surfaces are not really a major source of contamination. But that was the original thinking in the early stages of the COVID. Now we know that COVID is transmitted both by droplets as well as aerosols. Aerosols are the lighter fluid particles, and because they are lighter, they remain suspended up in the air for a much longer period of time. Now, coming back to screens, of course, screens do reduce the risk. They reduce the risk extensively. How extensively depends on the screen. Obviously, if a person is screened from floor to ceiling, you reduce the risk to zero, but obviously that's not practical. So proportionately, how much is transmitted by aerosols, which are the finer particles which remain suspended, potentially over a screen, That will depend on how high the screen is. And the higher the screen, obviously, you're going to reduce the risk proportionately. So that's just the reason why this had a bearing on the isolation and quarantine regulation changes was that initially one would define what's called what would be a contact if you came in proximity to individual who's infected within about 1.5 meters or 6 feet. And that was premised on the fact that the infection would be transmitted by droplets. Now we know that aerosols are a factor, and therefore that kind of criteria is to a large extent been fallen away. And this is why we thought, well, anyway, one can get infected by aerosols further away than 6 feet. Therefore, the contact thing didn't seem to make too much sense, and that's why it was abolished, together with the other criteria that the seroprevalence, the antibodies are very much higher in the population, that most people are asymptomatically affected, et cetera, the things I dealt with last time. So those were the questions. Yeah, I think I'll call it a day now. Thank you very much for watching and listening. And all the best. Keep well, keep safe. Bye-bye.